Hello everyone. In my latest video, I mentioned that I'd be working on a tutorial about using multiple Phoenix simulators and merging them to create a continuous ocean surface. I'm still going to do that, but as I was preparing my scenes and jotting down some notes, I realized there are a few things that might be better explained in a shorter, quick tip video. For instance, what happens when you duplicate a Phoenix simulation, what Phoenix does behind the scenes to ensure each copy reads the same cache sequence, how to modify this behavior, and some tips on creating your own custom default output path. So let's dive right in. Here is a simple scene that has a tap water preset added. Phoenix presets are not only a great way to have a quick starting point, but they are also handy if you want to test something quickly. They can be accessed from the Phoenix toolbar. Let me first select everything and hit delete. I'll go ahead and press the tap water preset icon, and the setup will be created instantly with a single click. This one even points to the same location where the one that I just deleted had stored the cache files. So what's that location? If I go into the output rollout, the simulation cache save path field says $, and then scene path, put in brackets. This scene path macro points to the location where your scene is saved, and that's all you need to know to work effortlessly with Phoenix. There's a bit more to it, and I'll try to explain. But if you are not interested, you can skip ahead and go to the next video chapter. If you are, though, let's dive a bit further. The scene path macro is actually getting replaced by a few other macros, starting with a data_dir macro. The data_dir by default is just the directory macro, this one, the one that says $dir, the folder where the scene is saved. The reason it doesn't start directly with that is that the data_dir can be changed in the Phoenix preferences. You can go into the main menu, select Phoenix FD, and choose Preferences. And here on top, you can see what the default cache directory, meaning the data_dir, is getting replaced by. Again, the default is the folder where the scene is saved, but you can change that. You can point that to any location you choose, and the preferences will be saved. But anyway, whether it is data_dir or simply dir, if you don't change the preferences, they both point to the same location. Next, there's a scene macro. That's just the name of your scene file, followed by an underscore Phoenix frames suffix added at the end. That's a subfolder that will be created and where your cache files will go. It's this folder right here. Another macro constructs the name of the cache files, which is the node name. The node name is the name of your simulation grid, followed by an underscore and then 4 digits for the frame numbers. If you click on the 3 dots button next to that field and select Show File Name, you can see what all these macros are actually constructing as a final output path. There's the location where I saved the scene, a subfolder with a name, matching the name of the scene file, followed by underscore Phoenix frames. And then the cache files are named by the name of the simulation grid and then the frame index. If this sounds complicated, perhaps I'm not explaining it very well. The good news is that Phoenix does a great job of handling all of this by itself, and you may never have to deal with those macros. The reason I wanted to talk about it is because of what happens when you rename a Phoenix simulator. What happens if you save the scene under a different name? And what happens when you duplicate a simulator and have multiple copies that have different names but reading the same cache sequence? Let's look into that. If you decide to change the name of the simulator node, all the related macros will generate a new path based on the updated name. However, if you already have a cached file sequence that was simulated with the old name, the new path will be invalid, and Phoenix won't be able to locate the files. Fortunately, Phoenix has a built-in feature to prevent this issue. When you change the name, Phoenix automatically renames the entire file sequence to match the new simulator name. This is incredibly convenient. You don't need to use any external batch rename tools. Phoenix handles it all for you. It usually happens behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about it. When you decide to change the name of a scene, for example, by using the Save As option and clicking the plus button to create a new version, this will also change the output path. Remember, the scene name is used to name the subfolder where the files are stored. When you do this, Phoenix will ask you a question. Do you want to start clean with no caches associated with the new scene? Or do you want to copy the existing caches into a new folder that matches the new scene name? If you select No, nothing will happen. You might be saving a new scene version to make some modifications and run a new simulation with the updated settings. But if you choose, yes, yes, I want to keep the files, Phoenix will copy all of them into the new folder, and the new scene path macro will point to that location. This is another functionality that is built into Phoenix to simplify your day-to-day tasks. Sometimes you might need to take a Phoenix simulation and create multiple copies, with all the nodes reading from the same cache sequence. That's exactly how I created this swimming pool scene. I made just one simulation and copied it several times. In 3ds Max, you can simply shift-drag the object in the viewport to make a copy. Let's say I want to make just one copy. The new simulator will have a different name, and its scene path macro will point to an invalid location. If Phoenix renames the cache files to match the new simulator's name, the original simulator won't be able to find them. However, in the viewport, everything seems fine. Both simulators load the same sequence, despite the name difference. In fact, if I rename the original simulator, or any of the copies for that matter, it won't affect the file names at all. That's because Phoenix handled things a bit differently this time. It broke down the scene path macro into its components. Now, we have the dir macro, which is the same as the data dir macro since I didn't change it in my preferences. Right. So we have the folder where the scene is saved, followed by a subfolder named after the scene file with an underscore and a Phoenix frames suffix. And at the end of the path string, we have the cache file name. This results in the exact same path as before. But now, the file name is no longer constructed by a macro that reads the simulator's name. It's explicitly written in the path string. This happened for both simulators, allowing them to read the same files. That's why if I decide to change the name of any of the nodes, the files won't be renamed this time. If I reintroduce the node name macro, essentially reconstructing the original scene path macro, it will still work for the original simulation. However, it won't work for the copy because it would point to a location that doesn't exist due to its different name. So I need to leave the copy pointing to the explicitly written file name. Now, when the original grid has the file name constructed by a macro again, renaming it will once again change the file names. But this will make the path inside the copy invalid. Most likely that is not what you want, so, try to avoid that. All right, let's reset everything and walk through this again to recap the situation. First, I'll change the name of the original grid back to its initial name. This will also rename the files, allowing the grid's copy to find them again. Actually, you know what? Let's name it Original. Next, I'll click the three dots button and select Reset to Default, which will bring back the original scene path macro. Remember, the scene path macro is just a combination of the other macros that were in place before, so the path itself won't change. Now, let's delete the copy and create it again. Shift-drag in the viewport and choose to create one copy, or better yet, let's make 2 or 3 copies. Click OK, and that's it. That's all you need to do. Phoenix will handle the output paths and ensure everything works as expected. But what about the input paths? The input paths will stay the same, with each one pointing to its own output. You can also adjust the offset for each copy, making them appear different. That's why we made copies and not instances, right? Let me get rid of those extra copies and leave just one to keep things simple as we continue. Now, here's a question. Why does Phoenix change the output paths instead of just modifying the input fields? The idea might be that you can start the simulation from any of the copies and overwrite the caches. But to do that, you'll need to copy the emitter geometry as well. And then the new object has to be included in the source. Plus, if you have any colliders, you'll likely need to duplicate those too. Honestly, this approach may not be the most practical. So here's a better option. You can leave the output field for all the copies blank. The input says, same as output, but the output is empty. However, you can add the name of another simulator right after the input macro. For example, the name of the original grid, which still has the correct path. Think of it like a parent grid. All the copies will reference it and load the same cache sequence from that parent simulation. You can reset the output macro to its default shorter version. Don't worry, it won't break anything. Here's how this can be useful in your day-to-day workflow. Delete everything except the main grid. Add the main grid's name to the same as output macro. Clear the output field temporarily. Shift-drag to create your copies. Then, reset the path for the original grid. This way, if you accidentally select one of the copies and try to start a simulation, Phoenix will warn you that the output path is incorrect, preventing it from saving any files. That's great because it helps avoid mistakes and stops you from accidentally overwriting your caches. But you can still run the simulation from the main grid and all the copies will be updated. There's one last thing I want to share with you. My personal workflow, how I organize my projects and cache files, and why I prefer it that way. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the default output path being tied to the scene name. I get why it's useful. Knowing which simulation came from which scene file can be helpful. But I experiment a lot and often mess up my scenes, so I keep tons of different versions. I think most people work like this. It's just common sense, right? I even have the Save Incremental button on my toolbar. Phoenix copies the same cache files into a new folder just so that each scene file can find them. Sure, if you're tweaking a simulation, the cache files will be different. But what if you're working on other aspects of the scene, like adjusting the water shader or the emission curve of a fire simulation? Or maybe you have more than one simulation grid in the scene, and you're only tweaking one of them. Here's an example. Let's say I have several cascaded water simulations. I've already simulated the first two, and I'm working on the last one. But now I want to try something different. I want to keep my current scene and experiment with a new one. All my caches are linked to the old scene file. So Phoenix has to copy gigabytes of cache files just to put them in a new folder with the new scene name. And I mean, it will copy everything. The caches for the small waterfall, the caches for the floating inflatable pool ring, everything. This can quickly eat up your hard drive space. Plus, it takes time to copy all those files. Sure, you could avoid this by changing the paths to a specific location, keeping the files in the folder named after the previous version of the scene. But that kind of defeats the purpose of having folders named after the scene files, doesn't it? Also, even if you have multiple simulators, all of their files are dumped in that one folder. I can't say I like that very much. Also, I'm not a fan of the underscore Phoenix frame suffix. I don't know, it just triggers my mild OCD for some reason. I also prefer keeping cache files on a different drive. Having the cache folder right next to the scene file is convenient. But I got an SSD drive specifically to store my caches and speed up my simulations. This SSD drive is only 4 terabytes, so keeping an entire project there isn't ideal. I store my projects on a larger hard drive where I keep everything else: textures, references, rendered sequences, and other non-Max related stuff like After Effects files and delivery files. On the SSD drive, I store ACES profiles, After Effects temp files, the DaVinci Resolve library, Gaia temp folder, Reality Capture temp folder, and of course, a folder called PHX for all my Phoenix simulations. Sorry, I'll have to blur this part because it might be confidential, and I don't want to upset anyone. But these are project folders, each named accordingly. I really like the project functionality in Max. Whenever I start working on something, the first thing I do is create a project. Even this tutorial video has its own Max project. Here's how it looks. There's a folder for my assets, models, textures, HDRIs, etc., where I collect everything for the project in case I need to pack it up and send it to someone. Then there's the auto backup folder, where each project keeps its own set of backups. And of course, there are folders for previews, renders, scenes, and so on. All of this stays on the hard drive. By the way, I renamed this project because the name I chose initially was quite a mouthful. In the Scenes folder, I have the 2 files I made for this tutorial and the 2 folders that Phoenix created to store the cache files. For this video, I reset my output path to the default. But let me show you what my custom default path looks like. Here's what I use. It starts with an environment variable macro. You can set your environment variables in your Windows System Properties dialog. There's a button down here. Press it to open the variables dialog. Select New. You can name that variable whatever you want. In the value field, put the location where you want it to point. For me, that's the F drive in a folder called PHX. The name you choose goes between the brackets of the Phoenix macro. I name mine PHX cache. So Phoenix will check Windows system variables for a variable that has the same name and see where it points. Of course, you can just put that path directly in here. But if I move the project to another machine without an F drive, I'd need to change all the paths in all the scenes. Sure, some scripts can do that for you, but why not avoid the hassle? Simply create an environment variable on the other machine as well and point it to whatever drive you use to store your simulation files there. Phoenix will pick it up automatically. Next, I have a project name folder. I've put asterisks on both ends, which makes the entire path invalid. That works for me because if I forget to put the actual project name here, Phoenix will warn me that this is not a valid output path. Without the asterisks or any invalid symbols, Phoenix would just create a folder called project name and dump everything in there. That's not what I want, so those asterisks act as a failsafe. I said it this way because, unfortunately, Phoenix doesn't have a project name macro to pick the name of the project. If there was one, I would have used it here instead. Next, I have a subfolder. Its name is based on the name of the simulation grid, not the scene name, and it's followed by an underscore and a version number. Inside that folder, the files are named with the same name as the Phoenix node and 4 digits for the frame index. I can enter this string into the output field, manually add the name of my project, and start the simulation. This way, all of my simulation files go on the SSD drive in a folder called PHX, properly sorted by projects. That's the only thing I need to know to find them. Inside, there are folders for each simulator. I know which one is the latest because they have version numbers. If I save a new scene, nothing is copied. The new scene still links to the latest versions of the caches. In the new scene, I can mess up the settings however I want. If I don't care about keeping the current simulation of any of those grids, I can simulate it again and overwrite any of the existing files. If I do want to keep it, I can enter a new version number before starting a new simulation. A new folder will be created. You can always flip back and forth between the different versions and compare them. All right, this is all very nice, but how do you save this string as a default path in Phoenix? It's an invalid path because of the asterisks, and I can't change my preferences with it. Initially, I kept this string in a text file on my desktop and copied it every time. Yeah, that's how much I prefer organizing things this way. But at some point, Autodesk introduced this nice new feature in Max, where you can change the defaults for every single field. I believe it was added last year or so. So if you're using a more recent version of Max, you can simply right-click on the field and choose Set as New Default. Oh, and by the way, you can also set a new default for the backup interval. I've seen people create a new simulation node, and the first thing they do is go in and change this to 5 instead of the default 15. If you prefer having a backup created every 5 frames, you can set this as a new default as well. That's how I work and how I've been keeping my defaults for the past year, taking advantage of writing the caches on a faster drive and having them organized by projects with a version number that's easy to track and not dependent on the version of the scene file. That said, while working on this video and resetting my workflow to factory settings to record my screen, I started wondering, what would I do if I were on an older version of Max? I know many people are still using Max 2021 and 2022. They won't be able to save their own custom strings. So, would it be possible to make a simple Max script to handle this? And believe me, I have and I mean very limited knowledge of Max script. But I know how to use the listener and see what Max does when I change something. I opened the listener and enabled the macro recorder. I changed the output of the simulator and got this line. The sim output property for the selected object was changed to followed by my string. I pasted it into the script editor, cleared the output field, and executed that line by pressing Enter. And it worked. Now I can take this line, drag it, and drop it onto a toolbar. That creates a macro script calling that line of code, allowing me to set my custom default string even if I keep my factory default scene path macro. I got really excited about this. I thought, this isn't a bad workflow. I can definitely use this. And since I'm using MaxScript, There has to be a way to get the correct project name and use it instead of the placeholder name. I searched online and found functions like get current project folder, which was supposed to return the project folder's name. It returned the entire path, though. So I asked the friendly folks on Stack, and they quickly provided an answer. While waiting, I thought, why not ask ChatGPT as well? Maybe it would know the answer. And it did. It gave me the exact same answer as the one from Stack. Now I can insert my line of code that changes the sim output, evaluate the script, and drag it onto my toolbar to create a button. However, this only works if you have a simulator selected. It breaks if there's no selection or if the selected objects aren't Phoenix simulators. But since I already had the chat open, I asked it to write a more sophisticated script that wouldn't break. It provided a few versions that didn't work initially. We had a bit of back and forth, but in less than 20 minutes, I ended up with a script that does exactly what I want and works flawlessly. I saved it in my scripts folder, created a macro to call the script file, and now if I go to Customize User Interface, Toolbar tab, I have a ZTools category where I've collected some useful scripts. Some are simple scripts I made myself using the Mac Script Listener. And there's the new one. I can drag it onto a toolbar, and this is what I'll probably use from now on. I started this video chapter by explaining my current workflow. As I was talking, I ended up modifying it. But I'll leave the video as it is. I won't re-record anything. After all, it's my workflow and everyone has their own preferences, right? Hopefully, seeing how I worked until now and what I did to change it might give you some ideas for building your own workflow. And most of all, I hope that after watching this video, you'll have better control over your simulation output settings and a better overall experience. All right, I think that's about it. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.